Welcome to this semi-abstract acrylic painting tutorial where I use a palette knife to paint this picture. So, shall we get started? So I'm painting this in a slightly different way. So I'm actually using tubes, acrylic tubes, to squeeze out some white paint. So I'm kind of almost drawing with my tubes, as it were. So I've got plenty of paint here and I'm just sort of using this area for the light and white of the sky. What I loved about this photograph, it's very atmospheric and it's got lots of darks and lights, so it's great practice. So here I'm putting in a dark sort of bluey grey on the right hand side for the buildings here. And what I've done is I put some framing tape around the edge of the acrylic paper, and I'm just putting a little bit of that dark blue grey to the top left here for the building, sort of following the perspective line of the building as well, looking at everything as shapes rather than worrying about outlines, etc. I'm just putting some dark grey in the foreground here, just using the tube to paint with. And it's a great way of tricking your mind into sort of seeing the sort of shapes of the painting rather than worrying about all the details at this stage. So it's a really nice, loose, sort of semi-abstract way of painting. So just putting a little bit more light there, and now using a metal sort of palette knife to sort of smear the paint. Now you can use a plastic card as well, anything you can get your hands on, even your fingertips if you don't mind getting messy. So I'm just sort of smoothing this out here, and it's almost like a buttery consistency. And I have to say, I really enjoy painting in this way, and I really encourage you to have a go. So I'm really looking at the photograph as I'm painting this with my knife and just sort of placing in the light areas to begin with. And now sort of steadily going up to that sort of grey blue and smearing my palette knife very gently. And as you can see, I've got a real combination of sort of dark and blues there. So I'm just sort of shaping in the perspective, both top and bottom, and blending with the palette knife, using very few brush strokes, doing the same on the right hand side, gently blending this paint and using diagonal lines to create the perspective of the top and bottom of the buildings there. And it is a joy to use a palette knife. I recommend it, especially if you're starting out in acrylic painting. It takes all the pressure off and you can create the most amazing sort of effects here. As you can see, the buildings get smaller as they go off into the distance and slightly paler as well. So I'm using some of the white to pale that down there in the distance. And I'm adding some detail to the building on the left here using the tip of my palette knife and just using the side of the knife there to swipe and just to pull off some of the paint here to create a lighter colour as well. Just darkening up the foreground here, blending that sort of grey colour with the blue up into the light area using the palette knife there. Painting using a palette knife, you get so many sort of different sort of textures, and it's really nice to blend the colours directly on your surface here. So I'm just blending these sort of three colours really, the grey, the blue and the white, and sort of printing here to create marks on the building. Bigger in the foreground, smaller in the distance. And I'm using the side of the palette knife here just to print some of the paint to create directional lines going to the distance, and just using it to create markings, as you can see here in the foreground, diagonal lines to lead your eye into the painting here. It really does create depth as they appear to meet at the vanishing point on the horizon. So it's linear perspective. So I'm just smudging a little bit of that just to make it look more natural, and also blending here to kind of create that sort of misty effect as well. I have to say, I'm really enjoying just moving this paint around using the palette knife. You can just scrape off the paint as well. And the other thing I've discovered is that because I've used so much acrylic, it doesn't dry as much. So it gives me much more time to work than usually when I use a brush. So what I'm doing now is I am scraping off some of the paint with the palette knife to create more light, and it's really effective. So don't forget, you can take off something if you don't like it just by scraping off with the knife here. I'm using my fingertips here to blend and soften to create the mist in the background. So the paint is still wet. And I'm doing the same in the foreground as well, which is quite a nice effect. And again, going back in with the knife, just swiping off some of the paint here to create lighter marks and adding a little bit more white now just to shape the sort of background sky here, and then blend and softening here with my fingertips. Just adding a little bit more dark here to the right hand side with the palette knife, really building up the details on the building in a kind of semi-abstract style. Just adding a little bit more black here in the bottom right hand corner where it's darker, and again blending with the palette knife. Some of the painting has dried, other areas are still wet. So I'm just sort of blending all the dark here in the foreground, a little bit on the building there as well. I'm adding some dark there directly to my palette knife, blending it to this building here on the left, making it really dark. It's almost a silhouette in the photograph. So I really want to capture that in this painting here. And this will create depth as well. So the lighter tonal values will recede and these darks will come forward. Plus they're bigger as well. So we're creating the illusion of depth here. Just working on the buildings here in the middle distance and the distance. So just printing here with my palette knife, swiping, adding some more white now straight from the tube and blending with the palette knife there, and swiping across to create texture as well, a little bit of movement, and again blending with the palette knife to get some soft muted greys. So I'm actually scratching off some of the paint here to create some directional diagonal lines. And it's quite a nice sort of technique to do. Sometimes your acrylic may have dried off, so don't worry. You can always print with paint, lighter paint later. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm printing using the side of the palette knife. And of course, there was a little bit that went wrong here. So don't worry. I'm using a cloth there just to lift off and then blend and soften with my fingertips. I think it's a good idea now to allow the painting to dry. And what I'm doing now is applying more white paint, wet on dry, using the palette knife, sort of swiping it on to create textures here as well. Just building up the lights here, using directional lines, diagonal lines leading the eye in, and swiping across as well. And putting some windows in here and there. So using a little bit of my imagination. Touch more dark in the foreground here, and I'm blending some of that light as well. So it's really sort of developing, isn't it? All these textural marks, diagonal sort of lines, sort of semi-abstract sort of painting here, and just adding a little bit more black right in the foreground, a few more sort of diagonal marks, printing that with my palette knife there, and a few more going across as well. And finally, I'm painting in my little figure using a brush, using some of the dark paint, painting wet on dry, painting this little figure here, just crossing the street using a small round brush and I've added a little bit of reflection there as well because it's raining. So this figure is almost dark against the light background to enable them to stand out because they're the focal point here. So just making the umbrella a touch bigger and just adding a few more final little details here using the brush, and also using the brush to create some highlights and sparkle on the road as well to finish off my painting. So I'm going to remove the framing tape to reveal a really nice white border, and it gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. But as you can see there, I decided just to sign it and leave it. It's a really nice way as well to present your work if you're not going to frame it. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Just click Patreon in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.